Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seventh chapter of our compendium. This is 7 of 26, and this is the second chapter of the founding era. And this chapter covers the administrations of Washington and then John Adams, and in these two sections. And each section has its own dedicated timeline, like what you see here. And this timeline has a bunch of documents and events during the Washington administration. And then this lower timeline here, which has a little bit less content on it right now, is the John Adams administration. So let's look at the Washington administration. The very first document that we have for this chapter is Washington's inaugural address. I have a video of me reading it. And this was delivered on April 30th, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City. George Washington's first inaugural address framed the new presidency as an act of reluctant duty at a moment when the survival of the Constitution itself was uncertain after years of weakness under the Articles of Confederation. He emphasized that the legitimacy of the new federal government rested on public virtue, constitutional restraint, and divine providence, presenting himself not as a ruler, but as a temporary steward bound by law and accountable to the people. In doing so, Washington established the enduring model of the American presidency as powerful yet limited, energetic yet republican, setting the tone for civilian government under a written constitution rather than personal authority. So if you want to read or listen to George Washington's first inaugural address, you can do so here. Georgia will create its 1789 state constitution. Washington will give a letter to the United Baptist Churches of Virginia on the First Amendment. And so this is one of many letters that the presidents will send to different movements. This is a religious one, and so yeah, this is very important. Maybe not very important, but if you want to understand the founding fathers and especially the first few presidents and how they addressed certain issues, like with the First Amendment and freedom of religion, then I suggest reading these letters. Thomas Jefferson, which I'll be talking about tomorrow, wrote a famous letter about the First Amendment as well, and how the First Amendment established a wall of separation between church and state. And that's pretty much the main opinion of the first few presidents, of keeping religion and the state as separate from each other as possible. And it's interesting that the first four presidents were very unique religiously. George Washington, some people are speculating, wasn't a Christian. He never talked about Christ in most of his work. So he's definitely not an evangelical. And his view of providence is pretty different from the normal view of God's intervention, and especially when it comes to Jesus Christ. So whether or not Washington was a proper Christian is up for debate. Same thing with John Adams. John Adams was a Unitarian, and Unitarians at this time are not viewed as Christians. And even today, many Unitarians are not viewed as proper Christians because Unitarians deny the divinity of Christ. They don't believe in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They just believe in one body for God instead of three bodies or three persons. And so a lot of Mormons, I think Mormons today are also Unitarian, but Mormons weren't a thing back then. And so, yeah, the first president, questionable Christian, talked about providence a lot. They definitely believe in God, but not in the proper normal, streamlined Christian way. Washington and Adams, but also Thomas Jefferson and Madison were more deistic. Um, for Madison, I think he was more of the normal type of Christian at this time, although he is a huge component, a huge proponent of separation of church and state. He gave this amazing speech that was in the last chapter for um, being against the state of Virginia adopting the state religion of Christianity and having a tax where the tax revenue will go towards Protestant churches. And so that was Madison who opposed that. So this is one of many letters like that from the first four presidents. If you're interested in the religious issue and want to understand how the early presidents thought about religion and the state. Let's see, Washington writes a letter to James Madison of his support for the Bill of Rights. This is early into the Washington administration. First act signed by Washington, which is the Oath of Office Act. First act passed by Congress prescribed the text of and procedure for administering the oath and read simply, I blank do solemnly swear or affirm, as the case may be, that I will support the Constitution of the United States. So that is the very first act that is signed by Washington, the first act passed by Congress, which is a very simple oath of office act. James Madison writes an address supporting the idea of the Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights have yet to be proposed yet. Washington goes and has surgery for an infection. Then you have the very first Tariff Act passed under the Constitution, the Tariff Act of 1789. The Senate votes on the president's removal power, tie broken by John Adams in favor of the president. So there is a debate in Congress at this time where the president could not fire a secretary or anyone in the executive branch without the approval of the Senate, since it requires the approval of the Senate in order to approve of that position, of that person in that position. So if the Senate is needed to approve a position, the Senate should be needed to remove the person from that position. And Washington and John Adams will argue against that, and this is a debate in the Senate, especially, and it's a tie. And when there's a tie in the Senate, the vice president, who is the president of the Senate, will break the tie. And the president of the Senate, or the vice president, is John Adams, and he is very much in favor of executive authority. You have the Department of Foreign Affairs. This will be renamed the Department of State, is established. The Department of War, which will become the Department of Defense, is established. And then the Department of the Treasury is established. And you have the establishment of the judicial branch. Not the Constitution, but the lower courts. Not the federal or the Supreme Court, but then the lower courts is established by the Judiciary Act of 1789. Resolution of First Congress submitting the 12 amendments. John Jay becomes the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Washington makes a famous Thanksgiving proclamation on October 3rd, 1789. Jay swears in as Chief Justice. New Jersey is the first state to ratify the Bill of Rights. North Carolina finally ratifies the Constitution. Maryland ratifies the Bill of Rights. North Carolina ratifies the Bill of Rights. Jefferson's account of the 1790 Compromise, which will happen in, of course, 1790. So let me just take a quick break and look at 1789. So you have all this going on. You have the first acts being passed by Congress. You have James Madison proposing the Bill of Rights. You have the first Tariff Act. You have the first three departments being established. You have the judicial branch being established, and the first Chief Justice. And you, by the end of the year, have a few states which ratify the Bill of Rights. And so that's a lot going on for the first year. Then going into the second year, Washington gives his first 1790 State of the Union address, and this address is talking about what happened in 1789. Alexander Hamilton will publish, excuse me, at the start of 1790, as the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton writes a report and gives it to Congress. And so this is the first report on public credit by Hamilton, and this will argue for the establishment of a strong national bank, and this will be part of the Compromise of 1790. South Carolina ratifies the Bill of Rights, Delaware, Pennsylvania. Benjamin Franklin will write a parody of the slavery argument. So Benjamin Franklin at this point is a abolitionist, and he will take the arguments that many pro-slavery people will use, and he'll flip it by saying that by pretending to be a Muslim who is enslaving Christians and using religion to justify the enslavement of Christians, in order to show how ridiculous it is for Christians to use religion to justify either other Christians or other people. So Franklin is really big into satire. You have the National Origins Act of 1790. This will limit the who can be naturalized as an American, and it will be very limited. Basically, only white people from Northwest Europe, so England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and Northwestern France are basically the only people who can become citizens of the United States. New York ratifies the Bill of Rights. Benjamin Franklin, he dies in April of 1790. An act establishing the government of the territory of Kentucky. And so Kentucky is about to become a state. Rhode Island finally ratifies the Constitution. Rhode Island is the last one to do so, of the original 13 colonies, on May 29th, 1790. And they'll also ratify the Bill of Rights in June. Part of the Compromise of 1790 is the Residence Act of 1790, which will establish Washington, D.C. as the location of the U.S. Capitol. So at this point, the capital has been in New York and Philadelphia, but many Southerners want it to be down south. And so the compromise is that the capital will be put in between Virginia and Maryland, and in return, the Funding Act will be passed, where the federal government assumes Revolutionary War debts from the states. Debts include paying soldiers or paying producers or production for weapons and manufacturing and stuff like that, and food. And you also have the Census of 1790, and I highly suggest people check out Jeffrey the Librarian's YouTube channel. He is making videos on each of the censuses, of the United States, and so this 1790 census is the first census. Although it's taken, like Census Day is August 2nd, it won't be published until 1791. And then, as I said before, the Funding Act is to strengthen the credit of the federal government by having the federal government assume the debts by all of the states. And then here is a letter to a here is a letter to I think it was a Jewish synagogue who sent a letter to Washington first asking for the members of their community to be exempt from military service. And in in this letter, Washington will argue that forced service isn't a violation of religious conviction because civil service is in service to the civil society, not to any religion. And so you may be religious and you may think that your religion doesn't call you to civil service, but Washington will argue that no, you have an obligation. You have an obligation to serve your society and to provide civil service, because that has nothing to do with religion. So this, I mean, I agree with this. I think that civil service should come before personal belief, because the civil service is more important than what your laziness from your beliefs might suggest. So I do think it's laziness and immaturity to not contribute to your society. Then you have the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1790 that gets passed. As per the Residence Act of 1790, the capital moves from New York City to Philadelphia in preparation of going to D.C., which will take a couple years still. And you have Washington's second 1790 State of the Union address. This is done at the end of the year. So the first 1790 address is at the beginning of the year, talking about what happened in 1789. This address, this State of the Union address, will cover what happened in 1790. But they both happened in 1790. Hamilton gives a second report on public credit, where he proposes, yet again, a national bank. And Congress passes the whiskey excise tax, and that will become very important because the whiskey rebellion will happen. You have an act to admit the state of Kentucky. Hamilton's opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. So Hamilton is now writing essays in order to convince people to support the creation of a national bank. Thomas Jefferson will give his own opinions. He will be against creating a national bank. Vermont is admitted into the Union. You have the Bank Act of 1791, first Bank of the United States established. And now Thomas Paine, he's in France, and he writes the Rights of Man in order, in support of the French Revolution, which is about to kick off. Washington will go on his first tour of the South between March and June. You have the Treaty of Holston, which will be a treaty with a number of native tribes. You have West v. Barnes, which is one of the first Supreme Court decisions of the United States Supreme Court. You have Washington's 1791 State of the Union address. Vermont will ratify the Bill of Rights. You have the Battle of the Wabash, or also known as St. Clair's defeat, and this is the worst defeat in U.S. military history by Native Americans. You have the ratification of the Bill of Rights, so enough states will. Virginia is the last state needed to ratify the Bill of Rights. The Coinage Act of 1792, just creating coinage for the country. Kentucky will create its own constitution, 1792. You have the Militia Acts of 1792. This is going to be important for the Whiskey Rebellion. You have the Button Wood Agreement. This will create Wall Street. So this is the first stock exchange being created in the new United States. You have the admission of Kentucky goes into effect. You have the Delaware Constitution of 1792. James Madison will write an essay called A Candid State of Parties, where it's a dialogue between a Republican and a Federalist. And, of course, it's a very biased dialogue where you have a person asking questions. It's almost like a party platform debate, but it's told by one perspective, the perspective of James Madison, who is a Republican. Of course, historians call the original Republicans the Democratic Republicans. One, that was a term used by the Federalists to demean the Republicans, and also because the Democratic Party comes from the original Republican Party. So you have the Republican Party of Madison and Jefferson, which will evolve into the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. So don't be confused when I talk about Republicans. At this time, I mean the Democrats. I don't mean the current Republican Party that was founded in 1856. Now you have the election, the second election, the re-election of George Washington in 1792. And of course, he is uncontested again. And Washington's 1792 State of the Union address. Who are the best keepers of liberty? I'm sorry, this is the one with the dialogue, not the other one. That's my bad. But they're both written by James Madison. You have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is actually just an amendment of this act, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and this is just a clarification and an expansion of power of a clause in the Constitution which talks about returning fugitives who are owing labor, which is most likely meaning slaves, who leave one state and go to another, are fugitive in another state, then that fugitive must be returned to the state whence they come. You have Cholsom v. Georgia. This is a very important Supreme Court decision, and it comes to this Supreme Court decision will lead to the passage of the 11th Amendment, which talks about suing states and whether or not a citizen of one state can sue the government of a different state. And so that's what this Supreme Court decision is about. You have the Patent Act of 1793, which establishes the Patent Office. Now we begin Washington's second term as president. Of course, he has his second inaugural address, and in it, he is, again, playing this reluctance kind of personality for the president. He's, like, reluctant to take power. Very Cincinnatus of him, although whether or not he's genuine about his reluctance, who knows. But he's like, guys, I want to retire. I don't want to. I don't want to do this anymore. Please just let me retire and leave me alone. But people just elect him again. Washington will create the neutrality, or will pass a neutrality proclamation. So what's going on in 1793 in Europe? And I will be adding this to the timeline later. I have to still add it to this timeline. This is still a work in progress. But this neutrality proclamation by Washington is to keep the United States neutral during the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is going on at this time in 1793, and a bunch of other countries will get involved in the French Revolution. The British, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Austrians, the Prussians will all get involved. And so the Washington administration will maintain neutrality given all that is happening. And in support of Washington's neutrality proclamation, Hamilton will write a series of essays, which are called the Pacificus Papers. And so I made a video of me reading each of the Pacificus Papers. And what these are arguing is just the legal argument in support of American neutrality. Well, one of the main arguments that Hamilton uses is the fact that that our alliance with France is a defensive alliance, not an offensive alliance, and it was the French who declared war on Britain, on the Dutch, on the Austrians, the Prussians, the Spanish, basically all of Europe, the Italians, all of Europe, the French declare war on. And so, because it was the French who was the aggressor, our treaty with the French is not applicable in that situation. So we don't actually have to fight on behalf of the French in the French Revolution. And so he just writes a series of these essays. There are multiple other arguments, but the fact that the treaty is a defensive treaty is Hamilton's biggest argument. Sadly, one of my favorite founders, Roger Sherman, he dies after a long career in public service. He is the only American to sign the Continental Association, Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He also participates in the state ratifying convention of the Constitution in Connecticut, making him foundational to every phase of early American governance. He's also on the Committee of Five to write the Declaration of Independence, and he's the only founder to have participated in all of these founding events, these assemblages of the American founding. So to me, Roger Sherman is the VIP, or the VIF, the very important founder that is totally underrated. Now, do I agree with everything that Roger Sherman believed in? When you read the Constitutional Convention journal, Roger Sherman gives a very aristocratic perspective of government. He definitely is an anti-democracy kind of guy, so I don't necessarily agree with him on that. But he was the one who came up with the, or at least the one to propose, the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise of 1787, which established not only a bicameral legislature, but that each house of the legislature will be representing a different demographic. So the House represents congressional districts and the people therein, while the Senate represents states, whole states, and the people therein. And so having a bicameral system where each house represents a different but overlapping constituency is a very important concept a very important frame for our Constitution and our representative government. Now, of course, the Senate is not elected by the people at this time. That would be the 17th Amendment. So, not yet, but it represents the whole state and elected by the state legislatures, who themselves are elected by the people. And so the Senate's indirectly elected by the people, not directly elected by the people. Now, James Madison will write a series of counter arguments to Pacificus, which is written by Hamilton, called the Helvidius Essays, and so I have all those here as well. Washington will give his 1793 State of the Union address on December 3rd. And because of Washington's neutrality during the French Revolution, Thomas Jefferson will resign from the State Department. And it is at this time that Thomas Paine will publish The Age of Reason, which is a pretty impressive work. I'm a huge Thomas Paine fan, and so I hope you guys will also read Thomas Paine, as much Thomas Paine as you can. Now, I especially like his American Revolutionary War work, like Common Sense and the American Crisis series, but post-American Revolution, when the French Revolution is going on, Thomas Paine is going to be in France writing things like The Rights of Man and now The Age of Reason. We have the patent for the cotton gin, and which was patented on March 14th, 1794. Now, during the Washington administration, he will pass an act outlawing the exportation of slaves. So if you guys read the Constitution, you'll notice that there's a clause which prevents Congress from passing any law to outlaw the importation of slavery, but not the exportation of slavery. And so Washington signs this act outlawing the exportation of slavery, and after 20 years since 1788, which will be 1808, then Congress can pass a law outlawing the importation of slavery, and we will talk about that act in the next chapter. Then you have the proclamation for dispersing the Whiskey Rebellion. So now the Whiskey Rebellion's going on. You have, at the same time, the final battle of the Northwest Indian War, which is the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Then you have the Whiskey Rebellion going on. And you have the infamous Jay Treaty, which was negotiated by John Jay and the British, and it will be a very, very hated treaty in the United States. You have the Second Naturalization Act, this time of 1795, which will clarify who can enter the country and become a U.S. citizen, which again is very limited to white freemen of good character from northwestern Europe, essentially. And you have the ratification of the 11th Amendment, which happens on February 7th, 1795. Thomas Paine writes a dissertation on first principles of government, another very impressive work by Thomas Paine. Hamilton will also be writing more political essays, as he always does. Rutledge replaces John Jay, since Jay Jay will retire from being Chief Justice, and he is replaced by Rutledge. A treaty of friendship, limits, and navigation between Spain and the United States is established, which opened up the Mississippi. During the post-American Revolution, Spain will close the Mississippi from the United States, which is one of many reasons why the Constitutional Convention happened in the first place is to deal with foreign threats more peacefully, like Spain, England, France, and so on and so forth. Tennessee will pass its Constitution of 1796. Ellsworth will become Chief Justice. Jefferson will write a letter to an Italian diplomat called Mazzini, and in this letter, he will criticize George Washington, and this will be very damning for Jefferson in the election. And once it is made public, and John Adams will win the election, not because of this letter, but because of other things, some shenanigans with Hamilton that we'll get into soon. But this letter certainly didn't help with the public perception of Thomas Jefferson, since he's insulting George Washington. You have the admission of the state of Tennessee, so now Tennessee is a state. We now have 15, 13, 14, we now have 16 states. Kentucky, Vermont, and Tennessee are 3 states that are admitted to the Union during Washington's administration. Washington will give his farewell address on September 19th, 1796, and the biggest thing that he warns in his farewell address is warning Americans to stay out of foreign affairs. And this is something that I think every American should read, Washington's farewell address. You have the election of John Adams as president and Thomas Jefferson as vice president, even though they are both from rival parties. At this time, the president and vice president are elected on separate ballots, not on the same ticket. And so you can vote a Federalist president and a Republican vice president into office, which does not really work out. And so that system will change after that election. Washington will sign a treaty with Tripoli, which does not end well. We'll see that in the next chapter during the Jefferson administration. The very last document that I have for Washington is Washington's 1796 State of the Union Address. Now we get into John Adams. And so this administration from 1797 to 1801 will have to deal with the quasi-war with France over the XYZ affair. Many Federalists demanded full war, while Adams pursued peace, preserving American independence through diplomacy, even at the cost of his own political standing. At home, fear of foreign subversion led to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which expanded federal power and ignited a constitutional crisis over civil liberties, free speech, and states' rights. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, articulating the doctrine of nullification and deepening sectional and ideological divides. Adams left office after the bitter revolution of 1800, which marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties and confirmed the durability of the constitutional system. So very important. And so for John Adams, we have his inaugural address. Adams will address Congress on the conflict with France, which will become known as the Quasi-War. Adams will give his 1797 State of the Union address in November. Adams will address the French attack on Charleston Harbor. This is the leading incident which will lead to the Quasi-War. John Adams will address to Congress on France, declaring an end to neutrality and an end to peaceful negotiations. And then the XYZ affair will be made public, and the XYZ affair was French diplomats forcing American diplomats to bribe them in order to have the negotiations. And so John Adams will inform Congress of this affair, which will convince Congress to pass an act to protect trade. And this is the act that will be used by the United States to justify arming its merchant fleet and will contribute to the fighting during the Quasi War. Georgia will pass another constitution, this time 1798. Hamilton will respond to the XYZ affair and the Republican Party, calling for more violence against the French. Amendments to the Naturalization Act, then the Alien Act and Alien Enemies Act will be passed. Each of these means that, especially the Alien Enemies Act, that if we are at war with a country, any citizens of that country can be arrested and deported. And so this is to prevent sabotage or espionage or anything that the other country can use its citizens who are living in the United States against the United States during wartime. You have an act to abrogate previous treaties with France. And then you have the Sedition Act, which outlawed any criticisms of the federal government, especially when it comes to its handling during the Quasi-War. Then you have a direct tax on homes, land, and slaves, which is the first federal tax on property. John Adams will give his 1798 State of the Union address. Virginia will pass a resolution against the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Virginia resolution is written by James Madison, and although he does not support the argument of nullification, unlike Thomas Jefferson, James Madison will support the right for states to protest and to speak out against federal laws that the state does not like. So, James Madison is saying that we have a right to criticize the laws, so the sedition law is unconstitutional. At least that's what he's arguing. John Adams will call for the militia to quell Fry's rebellion in Pennsylvania over property taxes. So these same property taxes passed in July of 1797 will lead to Fry's rebellion, which Adams will quell. And then we have the sadly, Patrick Henry will die. He died at his Virginia plantation after years of declining health. His fiery oratory helped ignite the revolution, and his insistence on individual liberties shaped the adoption of the Bill of Rights, even though Patrick Henry was against having the Constitution in the first place. John Adams, 1799, State of the Union Address. Now you have Kentucky, resolution against the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is written by Thomas Jefferson, and in this, he argues for nullification, which will be much more radical than what James Madison believes. Not even James Madison believes in nullification, where a state has a right to nullify a federal law if that state disagrees with the federal law. Now, this idea of nullification is itself unconstitutional, because in the Constitution, you have the Supremacy Clause, which states that the federal laws are superior to that of state laws and state authority. And so the idea of nullification itself is unconstitutional, which is ironic. And sadly, on December 14, 1799, George Washington will pass away. He died from complications of a severe throat infection, likely acute, I can't even say that, epiglottitis, after riding in snow and developing a rapidly swelling throat that made breathing difficult, and after aggressive bloodletting, called desanguination, treatments as commander of the Continental Army and the first president. He embodied Republican leadership and set enduring precedents for executive power. So George Washington most likely would have survived his throat infection. He had infections during his presidency that was dealt with through surgery, and I think that he would have survived this if it wasn't for the bloodletting. So desanguination was part of medical science at this time. Again, sadly. The capital moves from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., or it's D.C. It will be renamed Washington, D.C. after the passing of George Washington. The Federalists nominate John Adams for president. Secretary of State Pickering is dismissed. First instance of a department head dismissal. So John Adams fires this guy. And then John Adams issues a proclamation of pardon for the Friars Rebellion in order to quell it. And we have the 1800 census. Letter from Alexander Hamilton concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States. And so now, even though Hamilton helped get John Adams elected, Hamilton is now going to support Thomas Jefferson, getting him elected. And so Alexander Hamilton will write this scathing letter, the scathing public letter, an open letter, basically criticizing everything about John Adams in order to make him look as pathetic as possible, insulting his looks, insulting his leadership and his presidency, and this will not get John Adams reelected for president. Then you have the election of 1800, where Jefferson beats Adams. Adams gives his 1800 State of the Union address in November. Marshall, this is Chief Justice Marshall, which is the longest reigning Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's also one of the most important and most beloved Supreme Court justice in judicial history. Electoral votes counted. Jefferson and Burr are tied. After 6 days and 36 ballots, Jefferson is elected president by the House. You have the Judiciary Act of 1801, which reformed the Supreme Court, it modified the Supreme Court and the lower courts as well. And then you have Adams. He begins his midnight appointments, which are his last appointments, federal appointments to federal employees before the end of his term. He believed that he was going to have another term, so he didn't do these appointments yet. But after Jefferson is elected president by Congress, Adams will, the next day, John Adams will begin his midnight appointments. Jefferson's reply to being notified of his election. And now the very last thing that we have is the day before Jefferson's inauguration. We have the final group of Federalist judicial nominees are confirmed in the midnight appointments, and one of these their appointment will not make it to them in time of Jefferson's administration beginning, and so Jefferson will say that his employment status is not applicable for Jefferson, because Jefferson didn't appoint this guy, and he was elected president before, or he was inaugurated president before this guy was actually received his commission. And this guy named Marbury will sue, and that lawsuit will go up to the Supreme Court in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And in it, Chief Justice John Marshall will create the idea he's not really creating the idea. He will establish the idea of judicial review, where the Supreme Court can review a law and then declare it unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court also doesn't have the power to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court. That's up to the other two branches to recognize and respect the Supreme Court. And so this will conclude this chapter. Again, this is chapter 7 of our compendium. Tomorrow I'll be doing a live stream on chapter 8, which is the third and final chapter of the founding era. And it will cover the administrations of Jefferson and Madison. And a lot happens in both of those administrations. And so that chapter is called Republican Liberty from 1801 to 1817. So thank you for watching this live stream. And I hope you join me tomorrow, where we talk about the next two presidents. And just to let you know that this is what I'm showing you right now on screen is our website, www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. And this is our compendium, which is an online library of primary source documents in the format of an interactive timeline that you can look through. And what we have on the timeline are a bunch of documents that you can read the full text of. And we also include a bunch of events as well to give context to the documents that are being published and created at this time, not just this time, but all time from 1492 till today. And so I definitely encourage you guys to check out this website. We are a 501c3 charity, a nonprofit, so all donations are tax deductible. And if you want to volunteer, we are looking for volunteers to help us gather primary source documents, write summaries of each of these documents, make videos reading the documents, curating our curriculum, and other activities and programs that we are working on developing. And so, yeah, I hope you guys, whoever was here, liked this live stream. And I hope you're with me tomorrow, and you can ask questions. I'll be more than happy to answer and engage with the audience. I hope you learned something new of our old history, and I hope to see you tomorrow. So thank you, and have a nice day.